Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. Happy Friday. It's January 24th. I'm Justin Sasher in for Elizabeth Arkalian. Before President Biden left office, there was a concerted effort urging him to designate a large swath of the Sierra Nevada as a national monument, but there was also heavy pushback.
Because it would become a very highly restrictive form of management. Ultimately, that would overtake our current Forest Service-driven management.
Coming up, we speak with a leader in the movement against the Range of Light National Monument. But first, today's headlines. Farm groups are pushing for solutions as President Trump moves forward with a nationwide crackdown on immigration. KVPR's Joshua Yeager reports one solution farm leaders are fighting for is legal work authorization.
The push for immigration reform is nothing new to the Nisei Farmers League. The organization, based in Fresno, works with hundreds of farmers across the state. It has long pushed for work authorizations for California's legion of farm workers who lack legal status. Here's the league's president, Manuel Cunha.
They're 70 years old, and they worked 35 years, and they paid into Social Security. They don't have a legal document. And now you are going to deport them because of their status, which shame on the Congress, both sides of the aisle.
Cunha is headed to D.C. to lobby the new Trump administration to continue this push. He says authorizing workers already here would bring more transparency to the system.
With some requirements, and that is the biometrics, the background checks.
Calls for farm worker protections were reignited this month. Border Patrol agents arrested several dozen farm workers, with disruptions to the farm industry being felt immediately. For KVPR News, I'm Joshua Yeager in Bakersfield.
The California State Senate voted along party lines to set aside money to sue the Trump administration on Thursday over policies that conflict with the state's more progressive approaches. However, Democratic Senator Melissa Hurtado of Bakersfield expressed hesitation about the bills.
I feel personally that Trump-proofing is a missed opportunity to urge the president for meaningful change.
She says the state should be working with the president on immigration reform when possible, and suing the administration could create animosity that prevents that. The two bills the Senate passed would allocate $50 million. They go to the Assembly next, which could take them up as early as next week. California has already sued the Trump administration earlier this week over its attempt to end birthright citizenship. A Valley lawmaker is seeking to pool funding from California's high-speed rail authority. $1 billion from the state budget is allocated to the rail project each year. But Tulare Assembly member Alexandra Macedo introduced a bill this week to redirect that annual funding into wildfire prevention. She called the high-speed rail a colossal failure and said the state needs to do more to prevent wildfires. The high-speed rail project has been a regular target of conservative lawmakers even before this year's wildfires broke out. A large tomato processing plant in Hanford is shutting down. The plant, which is owned by Del Monte, is set to close in late March. It will put nearly 400 people out of work. A notice about the mass layoffs was filed with the state this week. Market analysts say Del Monte has struggled with high inventory and low demand for its products in recent years. The Hanford plant is one of 10 the company operates across the U.S. and Mexico. None of its other plants are slated for closure as of now.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from the members of KVPR. Join at $8 or more per month and access ad-free NPR podcasts through NPR Plus. Give now at kvpr.org/donate.
And now to our main story. In his final weeks, President Joe Biden designated 2 new national monuments in California, but the proposed Range of Light Monument was not among them. That's a monument a group of activists were hoping to create in the central Sierra Nevada. That proposal drew strong reactions from both sides. People spoke up at town halls and signed petitions to stop the monument designation. It would have federally protected 1.4 million acres, mostly within the Sierra National Forest. Late last year, we spoke with an advocate who was pushing for the monument designation. And today, we're speaking with Rose Wynn. She's a natural resources consultant for the California Four-Wheel Drive Association. Wynn recently joined our host, Elizabeth Arkalian, for a conversation to talk about why there was opposition to the range of light.
There's quite a variety of stakeholders and uses. The Sierra National Forest is actually called the land of many uses, and I couldn't think of a more accurate term for it. We have a wealth of recreational opportunity, not only including motorized recreation, which is really quite rich. We have one of the most diverse and technically varied systems of motorized recreational routes in the entire state. And it's really quite a treasure. It's much smaller actually now than it was just a few years ago, as travel management planning has reduced already many, many routes. But from what remains, we have a large and broadly integrated network of routes. And so those routes provide the motorized recreation access, but they also provide access for everybody else who uses the forest. And so other very popular recreational activities include, of course, camping and fishing, hunting, rock climbing, paragliding. You name it, if you can do it in a forested area, it happens in Sierra National Forest. This is really one of the core drivers of our local economy. Other than agriculture, our recreational opportunities in the Central Sierra are dominant.
So these off-roading trails are not just for people who maybe want to ride a four-wheel. It's going to impact lots of activities. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yes. So in fact, before I began working with Cal4, I was not an off-road recreationist myself. I actually became introduced to the sport through my work with them. I'm a hiker and a backpacker in my history, but I got to all the trailheads that I love on those same routes. And so those routes are near and dear to me for a variety of reasons, but that diversity of routes that we have does provide access for hikers, backpackers, horseback riders. We also have a lot of agricultural activity like cattle grazing, some timber, and other commercial activities as well.
Okay, so presuming those activities would be impacted if this land were to be designated as a national monument.
Yes. So there's some contended statements in regard to what would happen versus what could happen. And I might jump in and note that your organization opposes the monument as well as the Picayune Rancheria of the Chukchansi Indians. And the tribes are saying it would interfere with their use of the land, but I'd love for you to continue about how it would impact use of the land to your organization. Like we were saying earlier, it would impact all stakeholders. So that tribe, as well as others in this region, have opposed it because it would become a very highly restrictive form of management. Ultimately, that would overtake our current Forest Service-driven management, which is the intent of the Forest Service is to balance all stakeholders and have integrated uses that provide conservation of the land, also for wildlife and habitat, at the same time that it provides opportunity for recreation and reasonable commerce. There's a lot of laws and regulations that dictate how and where we can do all of these activities from recreational to economic goals. So that was our concern from the California Four-Wheel Drive Association standpoint, is that if a monument were designated here, it would very immediately shut down OHV access, which was where I was saying what would happen and what could happen has been contended. I know that the previous interview that you did on this topic, there had been claims made that, off-roading would continue, and certainly there were some provisions for that, but it wouldn't continue in the same way, and that it would be street legal only. And most of those routes, about 2/3 of them, would actually be closed and reforested versus remaining open. So that's a big difference, not only for motorized recreation, but for everybody else who uses those routes to get out into the forest and enjoy it.
So I believe you've stated before that it would close hundreds of miles of off-roading trails. Is that fair to say?
That's absolutely fair. We have about 2,100 miles of roads currently.
Okay.
And it would close, I believe, about 1,700 of those.
Okay, so big difference, and to your point, more restrictive use.
Yes.
We did speak with Deanna Wolf, who you mentioned, who we spoke to in December. She's the one leading the charge for the monument. She frames part of her support for the monument around protecting the forest from commercial logging. And I understand that's an argument you disagree with. Do you want to dive into that?
Yes. So the science behind the logging activity and the harm that it does to the forest as presented by the United Parks is quite different from the methodology and the science that dictates current use through Forest Service management. And the logging that happens now is not like what we saw many, many decades ago, where there were instances of clear cutting and perhaps some more abusive forms of utilizing timber and extracting it from the forest. That's been gone and dead for at least a whole lifetime, a generation. And the logging that takes place now is very highly selective. It's also very carefully planned in accordance with all the different regulations and laws that impact that form of industry. So endangered species protections, as well as habitat protections, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. It is already happening in a very balanced way. And so the vision from Unite the Parks is to put an end to all logging entirely. And that would not be, we believe, a wise use or approach to take, as we already have a very high densification of overgrowth across our forests. And that excess biomass from all that densification is something that very desperately needs to be dealt with.
At the end of President Biden's presidency, there was this big push to try to make this national monument a reality, as we said. It would have taken a presidential declaration or an act of Congress. Neither happened. So now we're back under a Trump presidency. What do you think the future of this monument looks like? Do you expect to keep fighting this actively now, or is it kind of on a hiatus, as you mentioned?
I do think it's on a hiatus. I don't anticipate that we're going to have any concerted efforts for this designation over the next 4 years. But I do think that could likely reemerge as an area of focus after 4 years, depending on what administration might take over from the Trump to the, through the next election in 2028. The issue of monuments itself will continue in that we need to see reformation to the Antiquities Act, which is the law that gives a president permission to create a monument by proclamation. And so I do believe that there will be some effort towards that end. In fact, there's already murmurings in the current new congressional body to discuss different routes that might be entertained to modify or clarify the Antiquities Act in a way that would rein in that kind of loose-ended manner in which a president could just designate millions of acres. The Antiquities Act itself was never intended to be used for these landscape scale types of designations. The language of the act specifies that it can be used to designate a specific historic or scientific object within the smallest necessary footprint to protect that object. And so there's a lot of really great uses for the Antiquities Act. One example I always give is like the Lincoln House. That's I think a 2-acre property where we had some very significant moments in history that took place there. And of course, it honors President Lincoln himself, as well as the things that he accomplished. And that was the site where some of those things were accomplished. And that's a highly appropriate use of a monument. But a landscape scale designation that impacts multiple hundred thousands of acres, or in this case, over 1 million acres, is completely inappropriate. It's an abuse of the Antiquities Act and really an abuse of the executive powers. And so that does need to be addressed. I think that there will be some opportunity in this current congressional body. There's, I think, a solid level of understanding and willingness to put effort towards that end.
That was KVPR's Elizabeth Arkalian speaking with Rose Wynn. She's a natural resources consultant for the California Four-Wheel Drive Association. We reached out to Deanna Wolf, the executive director of Unite the Parks, for a statement after the monument failed to be designated by President Biden. She sent us this voice note.
Now, with the Trump administration, it's hard to guess what's coming next. But I hope I can continue to help protect what is beautiful and wild in the American West and in the world. And we'll see what happens next.
You can hear our full conversation with Wolf on our December 11th episode. And that does it for today. If you ever have a story idea or feedback for the show, we would love to hear from you. Just email us at podcast@kvpr.org. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Justin Sacher. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.